this guidance, because there's so much you can get out of it. So even though we have this session today, please don't just leave it at that, and certainly read those parts that we don't deal with today. But I think we shall cover most of the difficult points. I hope so anyway. So next time we begin what one might call the New Century Group curriculum proper, which is based, as you know, on Choose Life, the Ikeda Toynbee dialogue, and begins with Buddhism and politics. So it really throws us into the deep end right at the very beginning. And I hope you're going to enjoy it all, get great value from it all. I hope that your health remains good so that you can get to every session of it, because it is of profound importance for the future, this group. So including this group, we shall end with the first group of the New Century Group, and the second group, which shall end with 250 young men and young women who have become members of the New Century Group, have studied together, asked questions together over more than a year, just over a year, and really cemented their relationship because of that. So, of course, it's not only to deepen one's understanding of leadership in terms of Kosen Rufu and in terms of all aspects of social life, but it's also to achieve unity and friendship and trust amongst each other, because you are going to find yourself the leaders of Kosen Rufu in this country in the future. So those 250 young men and young women should not only be members of Nichiren Daishonin of the United Kingdom, but also great friends. And I really hope that you are able to establish such friendships during this period. Then right at the end, we'll bring the other New Century Group members from the first session all together with you at the final general meeting and ceremony which will conclude it. And I hope maybe all together, the 250 of us, we can have a really lovely meal together and celebrate. Where that'll be done, I'm not sure yet. But certainly it's important we all come together at that point towards the end. Because, as I say, you'll be the nucleus of Kosen Rufu for the future. Now, this may not be realistic to you, to some of you it may be, but this, I'm sure, is what it all means. So it's not by chance that you came together here today. We often say that at the beginning of courses. If one understands the existence of the law of cause and effect, it cannot possibly be by chance. In some way, you've been together before. And this is really, in a way, what all this guidance, which we're going to study today, is about. That we have this eternal mission, all of us, to spread the law of Nam-myoho Renge-kyo, the universal law of life, during the latter day of the law. This is our eternal mission. And in lifetime after lifetime after lifetime, we have done this already. We've been together before. You have known each other before. Though this is difficult, perhaps sometimes, to believe and understand. But definitely you must have done. When I was asked by Sensei to go to Guam, that tiny island in the Pacific, where SGI was founded, I think it's 12 years ago, I had a feeling of incredible anger for the first 2 days I was there. Very strange feeling, because I felt that in some way, what was I doing on this little island in the middle of nowhere? None of us knew at that time that it was the founding of SGI. None of us knew, what SGI really was or meant, but there we all were on this little dot in the middle of the Pacific. And for 2 days I felt angry about this, because I felt as if someone had just picked me up and dropped me there. It was the strangest feeling, and it brought out this anger with me. And also, I'm sorry to say, I think I was blaming Sensei at the time. The anger came out in a way blaming Sensei. yet he had nothing to do with it, really, except that he invited me there. But I had to make my way there and pay my fare and all the rest of it, which somehow I managed to do. And after a bit, of course, I realized that this was ridiculous. This was, in a way, a sort of fear or panic. In fact, I must have made the cause, whenever it was in the past, to be on Guam Island that day on behalf of all of you. That's really the truth of it. And I think everyone who was there really felt similarly. You know, what were they doing there on this little tiny, rather ordinary, ugly little island? Nothing beautiful about it. It's as flat as a pancake, just like a little sort of leaf floating in the ocean. But there I was, and that was the effect it had on me. So that was quite a dramatic experience, but it really made me understand that wherever one is, wherever one goes, whatever activities we are doing, you know, we've all met before. So all those countries' leaders who were there, I think there were just 41 countries at that time, you know, we all knew each other, really. And of course we knew Sensei. So let's begin. We shan't, as I say, get through it all. And this time, unlike the other sessions, I'm afraid it's a one-way session, this. To get through all that may be difficult to understand in this guidance, it has to be one way. Sessions in the future, there is always time for question and discussion. But this is just an opening, a sort of starter. Okay, so let's begin.
Right. So I'll just read the first portion of President Ikeda's guidance entitled Practice is the Essence of the Daishonin's Buddhism. Life passes quickly, as do the seasons of the year. No sooner are we enjoying the fragrant cherry blossoms of springtime than we find ourselves in the sweltering heat of summer, which beckons us adoringly toward the sea. And just when we are bearing up to the heat, we find that we have entered autumn with the soothing cries of bell-ringed crickets, whereupon the season of yellow and crimson leaves begins. These past few years, unfortunately, the harvest moon has been obscured by clouds, impossible to see. However, as we are seated before the Gohonzon reciting the sutra and chanting Daimoku, a brilliant sun arises in the microcosm within our hearts, and an immaculate harvest moon shines at all times. This occurs because our life fuses with the Gohonzon, which is endowed with the functions of the sun and the moon deities. Buddhism thus expounds the mysterious fusion of life and the universe. It gives me great joy to know that all of you are struggling ahead day and night for the sake of Kozen Rufu. The Gosho and the Lotus Sutra clearly explain the extent to which you, who are devoting yourselves to Kozen Rufu, are admired and protected by Nichiren Daishonin. Confidence in this is itself faith.
Okay, if we can pause there. So just in the previous paragraph, Sensei says, Buddhism thus expounds the mysterious fusion of life and the universe. The mysterious fusion of life and the universe. And he refers at the beginning to the seasons. We live in a country where the seasons are apparent, we see spring changing into summer, summer changing into autumn, autumn changing into winter, and so on. This has a profound effect on our lives through the principle of Esho Funi, the inseparability of ourselves, our environment, right? It's often said, lucky are those who live in those parts of the world where they experience the four seasons, because they have an effect on one's life. Perhaps the variation of the weather and the climate, and therefore of nature, in those which those four seasons represent, keep us alive and vibrant and alert. Sometimes it's said that if you live in an environment which is always the same, it can tend to cause one to be sluggish and heavy and perhaps a bit lazy. So in that sense, I believe myself too that we're fortunate to live in a place where the seasons are so apparent, though of course at times we think the opposite. When it's bitterly cold or when it's pouring with rain, we don't always like it, but in fact this variety brings variety to our own lives, in truth. Nothing can ever be boring, in a sense, so long as the four seasons are functioning. So we have this close relationship with our environment, including the seasons, the weather, the elements. We're not in the least separated through that principle of Eshofune, which enlightens us to the fact that we're totally inseparable from those exterior things, such as the elements and weather. So perhaps at some point you on your own could have a look at a Gosho in volume 4, which is called On Omens. It's on page 1. The particular paragraphs that I'm talking about are on page 145 and 146 of volume 4, the Gosho On Omens. And in that Gosho, Nichiren Daishonin is relating our lives to the occurrence of earth tremors and earthquakes. The reason he's doing that is that he is describing and, in a sense, studying on our path the meaning and the effect of the earth tremors and earthquakes which occurred before Shakyamuni Buddha began to teach the Lotus Sutra. And these omens, in terms of earth tremors, occurred. So in that, he relates our spiritual and physical self, our senses and our physical makeup, to the elements, to each corner and direction of the compass. So, for example, in terms, let's say, of winds instead of earthquakes, an east wind is connected to the color green. Anything in the east is connected to the color green, which is in turn connected to the liver. And one meets people, it happens that I'm one of them, who are particularly sensitive to east winds. I don't know whether any of you here are, but if you are, you could sit in a cozy room with a beautiful fire and you would know when the east wind begins to blow, because it has a strange agitating or irritating effect on one's life. Anyone else experience that here? Maybe when you're as old as I am, one of you. I've for long known it, certainly for half of my life. And my mother was the same. She was always quite deeply affected by an east wind. This is a strange thing, that it means that myself, my makeup, is somehow deeply affected by this influence from the east, which in turn affects my liver and can cause one to feel a bit upset in the tummy and agitated and irritable. And to this very day, it still goes on whenever there's an east wind. Then Nichiren Daishonin explains that the west, which is connected with the color white, is in turn connected to our lungs and our noses. If a west wind is blowing, there are some people, often they don't realize it themselves, but are affected in terms of feeling a bit sort of heavy and clogged up, a bit sluggish maybe, a bit, achy and painy. This is because it affects the nose and the lungs and the sinuses and so on. Maybe not you, but maybe some of you, if you're observant enough, could notice this effect. Like I noticed the east wind. And then the north is connected to the ears. North is connected to the ear. I don't think Nichiren Daishonin mentions a colour. He doesn't in the Gosho, strangely enough. But he may do it somewhere in it, but not in those paragraphs. The north connected with the ears. I can't remember. You'll have to check whether there's a colour mention. And again, this affects certain people. Strangely enough, my wife, Mitsuko, a north or a northeast wind invariably, especially when snow is coming, causes her to have headaches and even to feel physically sick, let us say physically feeling like wanting to vomit and sort of general tummy upset. She's like a barometer. And we all laugh at the Richmond Centre because she always knows when snow is coming. But for a long time she didn't appreciate this until people began to notice, I suppose I was the first, that always before a northeaster blew and it started to snow, she went through this same thing. So peculiar, isn't it? But you also may be going through such minor physical upsets, and perhaps you feel you ought to rush off to the doctor and so on. But in fact, you might well discover, if you keep observing, that it's always connected with a certain state in terms of the elements or the weather. And the south, again, sorry, no colour mentioned. The south is the tongue. The tongue. Connected to the tongue. So, southerly wind in many parts of the world is very hot wind, and you may feel you don't want to eat much. But equally, southern people often have a very beautiful language. Language is part of the tongue. Latin people, Italians, have incredible, wonderful language, don't they? So, this is very interesting, don't you think? And of course, I've mentioned the negative side, but like all things in life, as Buddhism teaches us, there's also a positive side. So, for example, I don't know whether he had been referring to this Gosho, but I remember Dr. Yamazaki saying once, the most important thing from the point of view of the British people, I believe, he said, is the ears. And the ears, remember, are connected with the north. Because he said, always in Britain, you seem to be able to sing wonderfully. And you can put on incredible dramas, Shakespeare and so on, he said. Always things that are creating an impression through the ears, voices, music, singing, drama, and so on. So that was very interesting, remembering that in the light of Nichiren Daishonin saying that the north is connected with the ears. And then I remember he said, but in France, he said, we're totally different, because he's lived 25 years in France. He said, in France, it's nothing like the ears. He said, we're not at all good, really, at singing and that sort of thing, really, as a nation. But he said, we're very good so far as our noses and tongues are concerned. Noses and tongue, they produce such wonderful food. Eating meals is part of the great custom of life, isn't it, in France? I mean, often when I've been there preparing, say, for a summer course, it always irks me that it takes 2 or 3 hours for people to get through a meal in France, you see, because this is so important to their lives. Who's French here? Right. It's true, though, isn't it? Noses and tongues. They produce wonderful food and, of course, other things as well. So there can be no doubt that there is this connection, and it's good to be aware of it. It gives us a deeper understanding of life. And most important of all, it helps us to, of course, totally understand the existence of Eshofuni, the inseparability of ourselves and the environment. And also, perhaps most important of all, if the environment can have such a deep effect on our lives, of course, in turn, our life state must have an equally deep effect on the environment. So elsewhere in that same Gosho on omens, Nichiren Daishonin points out that when the minds of the people are agitated, then it'll be reflected in the weather. And remember, he was talking about his times when the greatest natural disasters had occurred in Japan, in the whole of Japan's history. This because the minds of the people were full of fear and agitation. Their life force was being sapped by teachings and philosophies which were basically nonsense. This was sapping the life force of the people. Therefore, of course, the Shoten Zenjin couldn't function. I'm sure you've heard it said, and you know perfectly well, that we feed the Shoten Zenjin with our life force. This is why it's in the first prayer of Gongyo. If we feed the Shoten Zenjin with a vibrant, dynamic Gongyo, then they will function to protect us. But if we have no life force, they can't work. They can't function at all. And as it's put in the Risho Ankokuron, they leave the land. So this, of course, is the Buddhist explanation of why, when the life force of people is being sapped by false teachings, why the Shoten Zenjin, or the protection of the Shoten Zenjin, leaves the land and these calamities and disasters occur. The 3 calamities and the 7 disasters. So the Risho Ankokuron was written for Japan in the 13th century, specifically. But in a general sense, Nichiren Daishonin wrote it for the whole world, because now we see in the whole world the same occurrences which were occurring at that time in Japan alone. As you probably know, I just recently written an editorial on pestilence. Pestilence is one of the great calamities and disasters predicted by the Buddha to occur if people, out of ignorance or for whatever reason, don't follow the true law, don't know how to, or don't live in rhythm with the law of Nam-myoho Renge-kyo, the law of life. If they're out of rhythm, out of sync, as it's put these days, then inevitably these disasters will occur. So AIDS is a pestilence. If you look up pestilence in the dictionary, you find it means an epidemic of fatal illness. This epidemic of fatal illness has come out of nowhere and spread across the world. So the cause of this pestilence is not any specific group of people. The cause of it is mankind, or humankind as a whole. Through our ignorance, or in some cases through downright slander of life, we've brought this upon ourselves. So, of course, the more people, therefore, who live in rhythm with the law of life through chanting Nam-myoho Renge-kyo, the more certainly we will step by step overcome all these calamities and disasters and achieve Kosen Rufu, isn't it? Kosen Rufu is the achievement, amongst other things, of overcoming the calamities and disasters which can otherwise inflict mankind. So it's quite a thought, isn't it? Everyone understands so far? Right. So let's read on.
The Jujutsu 15th chapter of the Lotus Sutra contains a passage which states, "Day and night ever persevering in order to seek the Buddha way." Simply interpreted, this passage from the Jujutsu chapter means that bodhisattvas of the earth day and night persevere in the practice of faith in order to seek the way of the Buddha and realize enlightenment. The Daishonin interprets this passage on a deeper level. According to his interpretation in the Ongi Kuden, the phrase, "in order to seek the Buddha way," is to be read, from the outset, seeking the Buddha way. Referring to the entire quotation, Daishonin states, "The attainment of the Buddha way takes millions of kalpas, but when you exert tremendous efforts towards this goal with unwavering faith in the Gohonzon, the inherent 3 properties of the Buddha are manifested in an instant. Chanting and propagating faith in Nam-myoho Renge-kyo requires continuous and concentrated efforts." Here the Daishonin reveals the teaching that in view of the principle of simultaneity of cause and effect, a person who day and night continuously exerts himself in the Buddha way has already attained Buddhahood and is living a life of unsurpassed happiness.
Thank you. How about that sentence, or the end of it? A person who day and night continuously exerts himself in the Buddha way has already attained Buddhahood and is living a life of unsurpassed happiness. But I'm sure there are some of you here who feel you're not yet living a life of unsurpassed happiness, and nor do you believe that you've attained Buddhahood. And this is the whole problem. The whole problem is that although Nichiren Daishonin said, and without a shadow of doubt it is true, that the moment we chant Nam-myoho Renge-kyo and live a life based on it, we are in the state of Buddhahood. Our minds won't let us believe it. That is the whole problem. We are in Buddhahood because we chant Nam-myoho Renge-kyo. In fact, there is inexhaustible supplies of life force and happiness surging through our lives, but our mind imprisons us from this experience. We don't believe it. So the whole process of the human revolution is opening up our minds to the fact that actually we are in Buddhahood when we do our best, as it says, continuous and concentrated efforts in terms of Gongyo and Daimoku, Shakabuku, and study every day. We are actually always making the causes for this to flow in our lives. It is faith like flowing water, isn't it? That sustained effort. But our minds don't believe it. That's the trouble. And of course that is karma. It's karma, our delusions, right? Our deluded selves, which causes us to be unable to believe this. So we have to go through a process of opening our minds to the fact that actually Buddhahood exists in us and that we are actually Buddhas. Everyone who chants Nam-myoho Renge-kyo is bringing out Buddhahood and therefore is a Buddha. But it's impossible for us to believe. So sometimes we feel despondent. Certainly we don't always feel joyful, perhaps. But in fact, the ingredients are all there to do so. So once in Los Angeles, I was eavesdropping really. I overheard President Akira, President of the Soka Gakkai, giving guidance to a Japanese young man. And it was standing right on the edge in the training center of Malibu. And he said, it was interpreted to me at the time, he said, you should chant Daimoku until joy rises up in your life. It's only a very short sentence. When I went away, I thought, hang on a moment. That's not happening to me, and I'm not chanting until joy rises up in my life. And I thought, next day, I'm going to start. So at the end of my Daimoku, maybe for 5 or 7 minutes, I chanted, just looking at the Gohonzon and listening. And incredibly enough, this immense feeling of joy just came from somewhere deep in my life. And I ended this Gongyo absolutely on top of the world. And what's more, that carried me through that feeling. The day was great. So after that, it became my habit. And I'm really thankful to President Akira for that. And from time to time, I pass it on to all the members like I'm passing it on to you now. But actually, this is the joy, the deep, profound joy of Buddhahood which we're feeling. In fact. So all the first years of my practice, I never knew this. My mind couldn't take this in again. But once I opened my life to the Gohonzon and just let Nam-myoho Renge-kyo flow from me, let the sound of it come back into my ears and feel its vibration in my voice and look at it with my eyes, that's what happened. Like an incredible great sun bursting in your life. You can all do it. But we tend to end our Daimoku still full of the problems that we're facing. From the very first minute to the last minute of our 1 hour or half an hour's Daimoku, it's our problems. Endless problems, isn't it? How on earth can we feel joy or experience Buddhahood if we're all the time saying, but this and but that? And this is what my life's like now. So, as I often say, it's no good sitting there in front of the Gonzen unless we at least give Nichiren Daishonin 5 minutes or so to speak to us. If it's us doing the talking all the time, this is my problem, and on and on and on and on. He doesn't get even one moment to open his mouth. So your voice, the Gosho says, when you chant Nam-myoho Renge-kyo, is the voice of the Buddha. It's the voice of the Buddha in your life. So if you really listen to it, you will experience this amazing joy. So through the process of doing Gongyo, we should be opening up our lives, opening up our Buddhahood, so that in due course we can really enjoy it. It's only our karma, our minds, that gets in the way. Okay, all right, let's go on.
Nam-myoho Renge-kyo is continuous and concentrated efforts. All of you devote yourselves to chanting Daimoku and carry out the practice of Shakubuku and propagation activities with your sights set on the goal of Kozen Rufu, exactly as the Daishonin teaches. This itself constitutes continuous and concentrated efforts. Have confidence that we who are practicing exactly as described in this passage of the Yongi Kuden are living our lives in the greatest possible way. Next, I would like to explain the Yujutsu springing up from out of the earth chapter, which is the 15th chapter of the Lotus Sutra, immediately preceding the Juryo chapter. It is the opening chapter of the essential teaching of the Lotus Sutra, which comprises the last 14 of the sutra's 28 chapters. Moreover, the latter half of the Yujutsu chapter, the Juryo chapter, and the former half of the Fumbetsu Kudoku, 17th chapter, together are referred to as the one chapter and two halves, Ippon Nihan. Expounded here is the core of the essential teaching, the key to all of the teachings of Buddhism. The one chapter and two halves was originally expounded by Tiantai, but the Daishonin interprets it in a new light. He identifies it as the essential teaching for the latter day of the law, or the Juryo chapter, as viewed from his enlightenment. That is, Nam-myoho Renge-kyo, the original cause for enlightenment, embodied as the Gohonzon of the three great secret laws.
Thank you. So, we recite the Juryo chapter, the 16th chapter, every day, and in doing that, we are, in fact, as you know, and as it says in the Gosho, reciting everything about Buddhism. It's true, too, that when we chant Nam-myoho Renge-kyo, we are also reciting all the 80,000 teachings of Buddhism, as it's put in the Gosho. The same applies to the Juryo chapter. So, in a specific sense, we recite the Juryo chapter in Gongyo in order to praise Buddhism and to recognize the flow of Buddhism down from Shakyamuni to Nichiren Daishonin. That is why we recite that, in praise of Buddhism and in praise of the Buddhas who have taught Buddhism down through the ages. But then, of course, we chant Nam-myoho Renge-kyo eventually. So it's still only a preparation to leading us towards the fundamental teaching for this age in which we live, which is Nam-myoho Renge-kyo. So we recognize the flow of Buddhism in order to give our ultimate life and praise to Nam-myoho Renge-kyo. Do you follow? It's a preparation, in other words. And I think it is, many of you probably find, that during that struggle to recite the Juryo chapter, which is quite long, isn't it? Really well, really rhythmically, pronouncing everything exactly correctly. It is during that struggle that we begin to lift up our life condition. That I'm quite convinced. It begins there. Probably by the time you get to the fourth prayer, you're really feeling as if your life condition has been actually elevated. But it begins in that long recitation of the Juryo chapter. The struggle within your own life, in other words, to defeat the negative force which is at work there. So it was Dr. Yamazaki again who described this practice of Gongyo as rather like setting off for a journey in a hot air balloon. In other words, what we are doing is severing our attachments to the shallow desires and influences of life, which cause us suffering because of illusions. We become deluded. We think, for example, that this obstacle is totally insurmountable, and we get in a panic and get frightened and so on. This is an illusion. We know, actually, if we've practiced Buddhism for a little time, that we can overcome any obstacle. But that illusion that is insurmountable gets a grip on our lives, and we get filled with fear. And the more fearful we are, of course, the bigger the obstacle seems. This is all illusion. So in the process of reciting the Juryo chapter, we find ourselves, of course it's mystic, but we do find ourselves being released from these illusions. Somehow our life state is being lifted, just as Gicho said, like as if we were in the basket of a hot air balloon. What do we have to do? Thank goodness I've never been in a hot air balloon. Nothing on earth will get me into one. But maybe some of you have, or wouldn't mind being in it. But what happens is you get in the basket, isn't it? And there are all sorts of cables and ropes and things that attach you to the ground. Those all have to be cut or released so that the balloon can rise. So that first struggle of Gongyo is actually either unknotting the cables or with cutting them through with a knife, so that your life condition can soar, elevated. There's a very, very good description of it, I feel. I've never forgot it since he mentioned it, but I feel we are lifting ourselves up, away from all those worldly illusions and our deluded selves, and really being our true selves, which is nothing else but Buddha. Really, that's it, isn't it? And if we do a great fighting Gongyo, we can actually experience this. So this is too what Sensei is talking about. We make these concentrated efforts, and that's the result we can achieve. So the Juryo chapter describes, or contains hidden in its heart the cause for the enlightenment of human beings, which is the law of Nam-myoho Renge-kyo. Hidden there in the lines, or between the lines of the Lotus Sutra. The Juryo chapter. Okay? Better have a break. What time is it?
5:30.
5 more minutes? Okay, we'll go on one more. Let's read on. Okay, Sandra?
Let me explain the outline that... Have I read that? No. Let me explain the outline of the Jujitsu chapter. From the Hoshi, 10th chapter on, Shakyamuni repeatedly exhorts those gathered to propagate his teachings after he has entered nirvana. How Buddhism will be spread in the time after his passing is a matter of great importance. The second Soka Gakkai president, Josei Toda, who laid the foundation of Kozen Rufu in post-war Japan, was deeply concerned about how Kozen Rufu would unfold after his death. I have similar feelings as well. Though one's own death is simple enough if one is satisfied with what he has achieved in his life, Kozen Rufu is a great undertaking to be carried on throughout the eternal future. Even in families, things do not end with one's own generation. Each of us desires the lasting prosperity of his line. Thus, even in the dimension of a household or a family, the question of what will happen after one's death is no simple matter. How much greater is the problem then with respect to the propagation of the law? I believe that herein lies the profound significance of Shakyamuni's repeated exhortations and appeals to his followers to spread the teachings of Buddhism after his death.
Good. Well, I can relate to that too. I'm deeply concerned about the future of Kozen Rufu of the UK. I wouldn't be any good to anyone if I wasn't. So inevitably, this concerns me deeply. And this is why 2 years ago, nearly 3 years ago, we began to form the New Century Group. Because of this concern. Because we must assure that in the future, the great leaders are there who can take the responsibility for Kozen Rufu on their shoulders and through their unity and friendship and trust together, create an ever greater and greater movement towards the new century, and indeed well on beyond that, into the new century. This is why you're all sitting here today. So probably you don't feel, maybe at all, as if you might be a great leader of the future. You may think that. Others of you may feel definitely I'm going to be. You may have all sorts of varied views on it. But the fact remains that I believe you will be. And your leaders in the youth division believe you will be. And since we're all chanting Nam-myoho Renge-kyo to the Gohonzon, I believe our beliefs are correct. Whatever you may feel at the moment, you may be horror-struck at the thought of being a great leader of Kosen Rufu in the future. But I'm sure, time will prove this to be so. And this is why I really beg you to get to know each other. You've got to be, an incredible, wonderful, unified force. You have to be people who can tolerate the differences that you see in each other, which of course are bound to be there, and realize that those differences are crucial for Kosen Rufu. They are differences which relate exactly to your mission or purpose in life. So all these aspects of Itai Doshin, I sincerely hope and pray you'll create through the years. So I don't intend to pop off yet, far from it. But I must make the beginnings for the sake of Kosen Rufu and for the sake of everybody who's in NSUK at the moment. That's why the New Century Group exists. And in a way, that's why this guidance is so very relevant and such a good thing to look at when we make the beginnings of this year of coming together, studying all sorts of social aspects of our country's life in the light of Buddhism. Right. Now, time for tea, coffee. Okay.